My name is Vartan Hartunian. I was born February 11, 1915 in Marash, Turkey. My recollection is that there were about 25,000. My father, my mother, my brother, three sisters, and myself. My father was a Protestant minister of the First Armenian Evangelical Church in Marash. My mother, of course, was a pumpish, or a minister's wife. And my brother was the eldest in the family. And as far as I know, he was simply being educated, as my three sisters were. I don't remember too much of a formal Armenian school education, because schools were dissolved as soon as the genocide began, and I never had a formal Armenian education. But my sisters were always with me. My brother and I were not that close. Sure, Albert is my brother's name. My eldest sister is Helena, Rose, Rosalind, and Lydia. And my father's name was Abraham, or Abraham, and Shushan, which means lily, translated from the Armenian. Well, there is about between 2 and 3 years difference between each one of us. So when I was born, Lydia was about 3, Rose was about 5, Helen was about 7 or 8, and Albert was about 10 or 11, something like that. I remember watermelon gardens, and they would grow very large. I remember the mountains overlooking Marash, and I remember particularly fig trees with the delicious popping figs when they were ripe, and mulberry trees and walnut trees. These I remember. I think it was a valley because we could see the mountains. It must have been the valley of those mountains from which our water supply came, and the melting snows would come in streams and run through our houses. We had part of that ice cold stream running right through the house, and we would put our vegetables and fruit either in the water or near the water. I remember a big watermelon that we placed in that cold water, which split because of the cold, I assume.
So actually it snowed in the wintertime then?
On the mountain. No, in the mountain, on top of the mountains.
Not in the city?
Or maybe it was the accumulated snow of the winter that was melting during the spring and the summer. I know nothing about my great-parents on my mother's side, except that they lived in Yovnuluch, which was one of the villages of Musadagh. And I do know, I know my cousin, who was an Andreasian, related to Reverend Andreasian, who was the Protestant leader on Musadagh. Musadagh to Marash, not very close. Musadagh is near the Mediterranean, and Marash is inland. I would say 800 miles, something like that.
It's a distance.
That's a guess. I'm just visualizing that it might be between 600 and 800 miles. All I know about my grandparents on my father's side is that my father and his brothers, which would have been my uncles, were all slaughtered in the massacres of 1895. And even my father himself was axed and stabbed and left for dead on a pile of Armenian male bodies. And he crawled from under that situation, and Armenian women who were not targeted for slaughter in that massacre took care of my father. I remember from about 4.5 to 5 years on, particularly after the armistice, being born in 1915, armistice was November 1918. For a while I remember a relatively pleasant family life. But when the genocide began, I knew nothing about it. As a matter of fact, when I was in my mother's womb, the Mutasarrif of Marash, the mayor, Turkish mayor, called my father and locked the door, closed the door, and showed him the order from Constantinople for the extermination of the Armenians. Now, this Mutasarrif was a good person, and he was a friend of my father's, and he was cooperative with the Armenians. He asked a very significant question to my father: what shall I do? A very significant question for any official of a government who is ordered to do what is immoral and what is horrendous. And my father pleaded with him and said, stay in your office as long as you can, and please help my people as long as you can, which this Mutasarrif did till he was removed because of what he did to help the Armenians. And perhaps I'm speaking today because he really helped save those members of our family that he could from deportation. Well, I remember a great deal during the attack on Marash by the forces of Mustafa Kemal after the armistice. This was 1920. I remember those years. I remember vividly that we were in one of the churches with hundreds of Armenians hiding from the attacking Turks, as it were. And another church nearby, where 2,000 Armenians had taken refuge, was surrounded by the Turkish soldiers. And kerosene was, smeared all over the building and set on fire. And anyone who tried to come out of the building, the Turks shot. Particularly, I remember a woman who came out screaming, and she was shot by the Turks. Believe it or not, 2,000 Armenians, men, women, and children, perished in that church. And then they came and started doing the same thing to our church. And my father felt for the first time in his life that this was the end of his life and our lives. So he gathered us in a little circle, and he looked at us with great love. And he said in Armenian, my dear ones, soon we will all be in heaven together. Now, I always ask my audience to visualize that scene. And I ask parents, if your family was in a situation of that type, what would you tell them? What would your last words be? Would you curse the Turks? Would you curse God? Would you rave? Would you abandon your family and try to dash your head against the wall? My father, I remember to this day, he looked at us with love, and he said, soon we will all be in heaven together. And I believed him. And to this day, I use that experience with regard to any situation in life that must seem troublesome. I say to myself, soon I'll be in heaven with regard to this problem. It'll be solved. It'll go away. It won't happen. What happened was we discovered that the French had dug some trenches from the church in which we were, which was burning, to a place where the Armenians were defending themselves. And that's how we escaped. And I remember the 21 years of defense where we ate horse meat, and I saw Armenians shot by the Turks. I saw the church bell tower caught on fire because of the Turks, and the Armenians chopped it down so it wouldn't burn down the main building. My early life was so full of basically horrors that although it's my duty to relate these things, it's certainly not my pleasure. sometimes I have to deliberately turn my attention to something else in order not to relive, as it were, those experiences. We saw the church burning. We even heard the howling of the people, and one or two, especially this woman who came running out and was shot. And then the whole church collapsed, as it were, in ashes. There were many churches in Marash. There were Armenian Apostolic churches, there were Armenian Evangelical churches, and there was a big Armenian Catholic church there. And as far as I know, all of them were burnt down eventually. I have a picture of my father, which the missionaries took, standing in front of this church I'm referring to, which was completely burned down. All you can see is one or two charred walls. And that picture was taken because the missionaries created a moment of truce between the Turks and the Armenians, and they did take several pictures, which now I have that picture, which I can show to anyone that would be interested. Well, I would say there were hundreds in the church in which we were. The church was set on fire. Smoke was filling the church, and the Turks were shooting bullets through the windows. The windows were high, so that the bullets were not hitting us. We were down on the floor, the windows were high, but the bullets were coming like overhead. And after this incident I described, one of the men told my father there was a way of escape. And we went through that tunnel, and a bullet came and went right past my sister's ear. And then, of course, we slunk down, and we found our way to the area where the Armenians were defending themselves. And they defended themselves for 21 days with arms that the retreating French had left in that area. All we know is that after the armistice, the area was occupied by French troops, among which were Armenian regiments, groups of Armenian soldiers. And we felt safe. You know, the French were here, Turkey was defeated, we could regain our lives. Well, one day, all of a sudden, we heard that the French were retreating. They were leaving us there. Hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of Armenians followed them. And it was snowy. And we heard that many of those who followed them froze and died in the snow. All I know is that our family and others just stayed there, and the 21-day defense was a result of it. We were simply abandoned. Orders came, I suppose, from headquarters for the French soldiers to give up that area to Mustafa Kemal's troops. There was a deliberate attempt on the part of the Allies to reestablish Turkey at the expense of the Armenians, and we were subject to that at that time. Apart from the burning church and my experience in the church we were in, the other atrocities I saw were the fighting Armenians against the Turks in that area, and one or two of them being shot. And I remember I was next to the one who was shot. They brought a bucket and put it under his mouth, and the blood was coming from his mouth like a fountain into the bucket. I don't know whether he lived or whether he died. Well, as I said, there was an American presence there, a missionary presence, and because of the defense of the Armenians against the Turks, which was reasonably effective, at least for 21 days, the missionaries went and spoke with the Turks and created a truce, and as if it were now the end of this struggle, and that the Armenians could have reasonable existence there in Marash. What happened is, after a while, I don't know, it was weeks or several months, the missionaries came to my father and said, we have information that tonight they're going to attack your house and kill your entire family. And so that night, Dr. E. Stanley Kerr was there. He was a pharmacist, I think. He had come to help the Armenians. He had a truck. They put our entire family in back of the truck, covered us over with blankets, and slowly at night, around 11, 12 o'clock, drove out of Marash with an American flag. And in about 3 or 4 hours, I don't know exactly the time, we crossed the Turkish border into Syria. And then we got out of the truck, and I have a picture that Dr. Stanley took of that truck with us still in it, just coming out of it across the Syrian border, which was still under French control, and we felt rather safe there. This we can attribute to our good Lord, to the providence of God. My father, of course, was in a death march. He started with 12,000 Armenians from a town called Iyintili. And 12,000 Armenians, when they reached Marash, the outskirts of Marash, when my mother was permitted and brother to see him, only 1,000 of those 12,000 were left. And I have to tell you this story. The Turkish officials were looking for my father. They wanted to exterminate him. They had him on a death list. So when the caravan or the deportees came and rested for a while in the outskirts of Marash, one of the officers with this death list saw him and put a big check next to his name for extermination. But the extermination order had to be given by the Mutasarrif of Marash. He took this list to that Mutasarrif I mentioned. When the Mutasarrif saw this check mark, he noticed it was Abraham Hartunian, his friend. So he ordered this man to supply a donkey for my father and some food and supplies so he could at least travel comfortably from Marash on. And that's how my father was saved. And the story is that he played dead at a certain point, and he was able to escape and take refuge in the college at Aintab. And he was kept there by Dr. Merrill and his wife till the end of hostilities. 25,000, I think, when the survivors returned, there were about maybe 7,000 to 10,000, those who were still there and those who returned. That's all I know. The Turks were in their own area. The Armenians were in their own area. Marash was divided between the Armenian section and the Turkish section. And therefore, the Armenians were very easily identified for extermination. I suppose we have to say it could have been prevented, but I can't see how, once Turkey joined Germany, and once Germany decided that it would cooperate with Turkey in the extermination of the Armenians, because there's clear evidence now that the deportation plan was given to the Turks by the Germans, clear evidence that they knew that the nation was being exterminated, clear evidence that they not only did nothing, but many of their officers abetted the genocide. They helped. I know in one town they brought their guns and just incinerated the defending Armenians with their guns, howitzers. So I don't see that once the war began, with the background of the tension and hatred between Armenians and Turks, and with the defeat of the Turks in the Eastern Front, where Armenian soldiers from Russia also were part of that attack, rightly so, since they were Russian citizens, with the propaganda and the innuendos and the dehumanization of the Armenians, I don't see how the genocide could have been stopped. Certainly the nations could not have stopped it. The Allies could not have stopped it. Just as I suppose they couldn't stop the extermination of the Jewish people.
Can you express your thoughts about Armenia's independence, and what does it mean to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's a miracle. I think it's a miracle from several points of view. Because first of all, nobody predicted it. Nobody thought it was possible. It was a consequence of the collapse of the entire communist regime, which nobody predicted, except some economists hinted at it. And I think it was a result of the courage of the Armenian people. Whenever there is a possibility of freedom, Armenians are entitled to it and will take it. I'm proud of the Armenian people, and I rejoice that finally Armenia is free and independent, with its flag, with its Tiram, with its government, with its representatives, and with its flag flying at the United Nations. This is a dream come true, and I think we should capitalize on it by supporting, defending, encouraging, sacrificing for the nation. And I believe that Armenia will be the Switzerland of the Middle East and will be a blessing to the entire world in the next 25 years. Oh, I see it as a great future. I'll tell you why. The world is going through hell. Armenians have gone through hell and they know how to deal with it. Our story has to be known. And when our story is known, it will help the world not only to minimize such tragedies, but maybe obviate them. And that's why I feel it my duty, it's never my pleasure, my duty is to report the facts, as I have in my father's memoirs, Neither to Laugh Nor to Weep, which has been read by thousands and thousands of people, and there have been editorials on it, and very many books on the genocide and the Holocaust refer to it. I think every Armenian should be part of this story because it is almost a biblical tragedy with a resurrection. It is almost a crucifixion and a resurrection. And I look at it that way. I think we have a great part in the providence of God to bring the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. Let me put it this way. The only expectation from Turkey I have is political pressure and economic pressure, and their increasing awareness that their denial of the Armenian genocide is not only faulty, but is failing. Finally, the scholarship world has confirmed it. Finally, their so-called scholars have been shown to be frauds. Finally, they're now permitting some writings about the genocide to be distributed in the Turkish language in Turkey. I'm referring to Dadrian's manuscript. Finally, Lowry has been removed from the head of that department in Princeton University. Finally, we're going to have a genocide museum in Washington. So I think that their denial will collapse within the next 10, 15 years. I think their responsibility is to be historically honest about the Ottoman Empire's planning and execution of the Armenian genocide, also to be honest about the losses of the Armenian people and their responsibility to not only apologize, but wherever possible, to make reparations, and eventually to create normal diplomatic relationships with Armenia. My message to humanity is to not be naive and unrealistic about evil in the hearts of humankind. Unless evil is controlled by equitable laws, it explodes into terrible events, especially when governments abet evil. The world goes clearly into the horrors of an earthly hell. What happened in the Armenian Genocide is that a government that is supposed to protect its people instigated its people against a minority people that depended on that government to exterminate them. All the evils that are inherent in mankind were released, like the opening of a Pandora's box, and hatred and jealousy and envy and covetousness and adultery and rape, all these took over and created this horrendous reality we call genocide, the killing of an entire nation. I think that, you know, we must preach from the housetops and from the tops of mountains and everywhere we can. Let this message be heard. It is true, although it has been repeated again and again, that if we forget the past, we will experience the repeat of its horrors in the present. This is a picture of the Hartunian family in Marash in front of my father's church before it was burnt down. Father had returned after the armistice, and we all got dressed for this picture. The little fellow in front is me. My sister Lydia is to his left, and then in the back, the tall one is my brother. On his right is my father, and then my sister Helen. My father's name was Abraham. And then to my brother's left is my mother Shushan and my sister Rose. This is the Hartunian family, and this was a peaceful time for a short time in Marash after the genocide presumably ended, but it was resumed, of course, as I have explained. This was about 1919, 1920, around that time. I don't know the exact date.